And we continue to remember the 41st President of the United States. Welcome to America's News Headquarters from Washington this Saturday. I'm Leland Vittert.
And I'm Ebony K. Williams. A nation mourns its 41st President, George H.W. Bush, who died last night at 94 years old.
Fox News chief political anchor, host of Special Report, Baier, joining us with more from the Reagan National Defense Forum in Simi Valley, California. Brett, I can just imagine the group of folks out there who all knew George H.W. Bush from so many different parts of his presidency, his time at the CIA, his time as vice president, all reflecting on the same man.
Leland, Ebony, good afternoon. You know, it is somewhat fortuitous to be here in this backdrop of the Reagan Presidential Library and the Reagan National Defense Forum this weekend, because all of these people, in some way, shape, or form, had some connection to the 41st President of the United States. And as you've heard from numerous people out here and all of the statements that have come out over the past few hours since his passing, there is just this admiration, respect, honor to look back at his life and legacy. Obviously, he was vice president to President Reagan, and some people looked at that time as he was in the shadow of this kind of larger-than-life figure, President Ronald Reagan, but came into his own as president and was his own man on a number of fronts when it came to foreign policy, domestic policy, and was the most experienced president as far as in different jobs that we have ever seen in the history of this country.
Certainly, the legacy of Bush 41 is vast, but particularly when it comes to national security and foreign policy. What seems to be the sentiment there in California as you are around so many leaders on that particular world stage?
That, Ebony, he had an ability to lead with dignity, a quiet kind of reverence of the military, but one in which he was leading with diplomacy. He, President Bush, was someone who reached out by phone, by letter to world leaders all the time. One of the interesting exchanges is that when the wall is falling, the Berlin Wall, obviously the result of a lot of years of fighting communism, President Reagan and world leaders and Vice President Bush, the wall is coming down. And Marlin Fitzwater, Brent Scowcroft, and others run into the Oval Office to prepare this big victorious speech about how democracy prevailed over communism in this moment. And President Bush doesn't want to do that. He says, "This is the last thing I want to do. I want to respond quietly because I don't want to dance on the top of the Berlin Wall." He had a concern for Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, and how he was going to react and how the Soviet Union was going to react to this moment. I think that maturity in that moment shows you, basically his foreign policy thoughts.
Brett, you talked about the sort of universal admiration and respect, and understandably so, for the people who worked with him and knew him and were both friends with him and served with him. Is there common themes about what earned that admiration, that respect, and the reverence that we're now hearing in so many of these statements?
I think it's how he treated people. He asked people questions. He listened to them. He was a really good listener. If you talk to folks who know him well, he wrote personal notes, Leland, a lot. He was a masterful handwritten note sender. And I think that what tells the most about President H.W. Bush, and actually this goes across all the Bushes, is if you talk to the people who worked inside the White House or the Secret Service agents on that detail, and they have nothing but high words of praise because President H.W. Bush engaged them every day. And when Barbara Bush died, the First Lady Melania Trump brought with her two members of the White House staff who had served under the Bush family, H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush, and went to the funeral. And that moment shows you, how much reverence and respect the people who worked for President H.W. Bush had for him.
Yeah. Brett, in just a bit, you're going to have a panel. You're out there in California, of course, for the Reagan Defense Forum. You're going to be doing a panel with Secretary of Defense Mattis. Can you give us some insight on what you expect to come of that conversation?
Yeah, it's just a one-on-one conversation with the Defense Secretary. Last year, I was out here and talked to then National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster. Similar Q&A, bounce around the world. Obviously, I'll get his reflections on the passing of the 41st president. But there are a lot of issues where Secretary Mattis obviously can make a lot of news and weigh in on big issues of the day as you look around the world and what the future of the U.S. military in a funding question going forward. He doesn't give that many interviews, so we're honored to be able to do this, and we'll bring it to you live on Fox.
In almost every interview Brett does, there is some news to be made, so we'll look forward to that. Brett, thank you. We'll be standing by. Coming up in the next hour, Bret Baier will talk to Secretary of Defense James Mattis at the Defense Forum. Brett's going to spend the next hour or so prepping, and we're going to bring that to you live right here in its entirety on the Fox News channel.